Hello, in this video we will have a look at SQL triggers. In an earlier video we talked about stored procedures, and you can say that a trigger is a special kind of stored procedure that is fired when an event occurs in the database. We have different kind of triggers. We have the DML triggers, data manipulation language. They are executed automatically directly before or after the insert, delete or update events. And then we have the DDL triggers, and DDL is the data definition language. These are fired when we have an execution of an alter statement or a drop statement. And we also have logon triggers for logon events. But we will only focus on the DML triggers, which is what happens directly before or after these insert, delete and update operations are executed. There are two kinds of DDL triggers. You have the instead of triggers executed directly before these statements, and you have the after triggers executed directly after these statements. We will show an example of an instead of trigger. Instead of trigger is executed instead of an update or an insert or a delete statement. In our postal address table, we have postal code and city. We now want to use a trigger to assure that all the city names will be written in only capitalized letters. So if someone tries to insert a city name with small letters, then we want to transform them to uppercase before they are inserted into the table. We specify the name of the trigger, create trigger, and the TRG. I use this prefix for trigger. And the name, convert to upper with instead of, on, and we specify the table, which is postal address. And then we have to tell that this is an instead of insert trigger. So every time an insert event occurs on this postal address table, then it will instead do what we specify down here. In this definition part, we use the keyword as, and we can declare some variables. And I want two variables because I temporarily want to store the data from the insert into statement. And one thing we have to know is that before SQL Server inserts real data into the table, it will temporarily store them in an array named inserted. And from this temporary array, we can read the values from postal code and city into our variables. And that we do by writing some select statements. Select at postal code. And we say that the postal code, this variable, will be assigned the value postal code from the temporary table inserted. And then we do the same with the city variable. But before we store the value from the inserted table, the city value, we use this upper method, which converts all letters into uppercase, capitalized letters, so that we are sure that the city name consists of only capitalized letters. And then we store it in the city variable. Up until now, SQL Server has not inserted anything into the real table. But that's what we're going to do now. And now we will insert these variable values instead of the values that were put into the original insert into statement. Now we write insert into postal address, which is a table, and we specify the columns the data will be inserted into, which is postal code and city. And then we specify the values which are going to be inserted. That are postal code and city, where we now know that the city consists of only uppercase letters. So that is the principles of an instead of trigger. And we will now try that in SQL Server. We will perform the create trigger statement so that the trigger is created and stored in the database. So I select this one and execute. It completed successfully. And to find the trigger, we have to go to tables under car owner, and we will have to go to the table postal address because the triggers are stored in the table that they belong to, and click the F5 button. And then we can find the trigger under the folder triggers. So if I will test if this trigger works, then we can write an insert into postal address statement. And now I want to insert another value, for instance 0001, and I write Oslo with only lowercase letters, and then the trigger should convert it to uppercase. So I execute this one, and we see that one row is affected. We can see that repeated, and that is because the first time it is inserted into the temporary table named inserted, and then after we have changed this to only capitalized letters, then it is inserted into the real table. So this indicates that the trigger has worked. And we can list the content of the postal address table. We will run this one, select star from postal address, execute, and now I will see that 0001 Oslo, and Oslo is written with capitalized letters. I can test with one more statement, and now I insert into 0002 and Oslo with some capitalized letters and some lowercase letters. If I run this one and then we list all, I see that 002 is inserted but with only capitalized letters. So this trigger works fine. We will write an after trigger to check for valid input data. We will assume that if a price greater or equal to 1 million is inserted into the price field, then it will be a wrong value. So we will have a test for that. We will allow a SQL Server to insert the data into the table, but we will write an after trigger that after the data is inserted, it will check if the price is in accordance with the condition, and if it's not, then it will perform a rollback, which means that it will remove the inserted data and restore the database to the previous condition. So we start by writing create trigger and give it a name, trg as prefix for a trigger, and I give it a name pricing error. And it will act on the table named car. It will be an after trigger, so we define it as an after, and it will act on insert statements, so after insert. And here, after as, we come to the definition part of the trigger. There I declare a variable named @price with money as a data type. And again, we will use the inserted table where SQL Server temporarily store the results from an insert statement. And with the select sentence, we will read the price from this inserted table and store it in our parameter named @price. And then we will have an if statement where we check the content of this variable if it's greater or equal to 1 million. And if it is, we will run these statements in between begin and end. And the first thing we will do is to raise an error. We use this raise error, and where we can specify our own message. And then we use the rollback statement to roll back the transaction. And then the inserted value will be removed, and the database will restore the state it had before the insert was performed. We will try this in SQL Server. We create this trigger in SQL Server on the table car, execute, completed successfully. So we can go to the table car and click the F5 button to refresh, and then we should find these triggers here, trg pricing error. Now we can try to insert a row with the reg number and the price, and where the price is 1 million or greater. You can try exactly 1 million. So I click execute, and we see that we get a warning, and it is the message that we have written here. You have tried to register a price of 1 million or more. Then we insert a new statement where we try to insert a number that is below 1 million, and that should be allowed. So I execute. One row was affected. To write a trigger, we start with the create trigger and a name and on, and then we specify the table. And this will be a after trigger because after we have inserted the data into the table with the insert statement, then we want to store the same data into another table. And we write the trigger definition. We will have 3 variables to store postal code, city, and a timestamp, because in the new table we also wanted to store a date and a time. And as we have said earlier, SQL Server will temporarily store the inserted data in this inserted array or table, and then we read the postal code and city that are inserted into the 2 variables at postal code and at city. And in the 3rd variable, we want to store the current time. And it is in SQL Server a function named current timestamp, which will retrieve the date and time from the system clock in the PC. So we assign that value to the log timestamp. And having done that, the trigger can do the insert into statement to our new table named postal address log. And there we want to insert into the 3 columns named postal code, city, and log time. And the 3 values that are going to be inserted, the postal code and city from the inserted table. And in addition, the current timestamp, which is assigned to the variable log timestamp. So now we can test this one in SQL Server. We execute this trigger statement to create the trigger and store it. Execute, completed successfully. Then we have to go to this postal address table in Object Explorer. We can click the F5 button to refresh it, and now we see that we have a new trigger named TRG log inserts with after. Now we have 2 triggers for this postal address table. One that converts every letter to uppercase in the city column, and one that copies all the data into the postal address log when we insert them and add a timestamp. So we will use some insert statements to insert some data. We start with this one, execute, and wait some seconds until we execute the next one, so that we have different timestamps. I have to use a different key, of course, primary key number. So now we try it again, execute, and we see that 3 rows affected because the triggers results in more than one operation, and then we insert the 3rd one. First we list all the values in the postal address table. If I go to the end of it, I will see my 3 new values, and I see that the first trigger has worked because all the letters are now capitalized. And I will also list the content of the new table we created that we named postal address log. So select star from postal address log, and I see that it has inserted 3 values, and all of them with different timestamps. So both the triggers worked exactly as they should. So now you should try this out for yourself.